Welcome back, everybody. I know that was a very, very brief break. I hope you all had a chance to run and grab a drink, etc. I am just letting everybody in, and then we are going to welcome Erik Molvar. All right, I'm going to get started here. I've met Erik. Um, Really, really, really nice guy. We're super pleased to have him on today. Erik's always really willing to give his time to wild horse advocates and let us know what's going on the range. And his information is absolutely invaluable. Erik is the executive director with Western Watersheds Project, a website I highly recommend you guys have pinned to your Google bar so that you can refer to it regularly for livestock issues and public lands issues. If you don't follow their Facebook page, I highly recommend doing so. They often have action items on there that you guys can do. In fact, I think I just did one this morning. Because, saving our wild horses is not just about saving our wild horses, it's also about saving our public lands and the wildlife that live there and the conditions on the range and so forth. So Erik, I'm going to go ahead and let you take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Heather, and I'm delighted to be here. And Western Watersheds Project, in contrast to a lot of the organizations at this summit, is not per se a wild horse advocacy group. We more take a more neutral approach to the issue, but we do like to truth squad the livestock industry and its scapegoating of wild horses for land health problems that are caused by the livestock industry. And so we're here to bring science and information and arm everybody with the information that they need on the law and policies to help get better and more ecologically sustainable management of public lands. And certainly wild horses can be a part of that. So we'll go ahead and get started here. I have a bit of a longer slideshow. I'm going to try and step through rather briskly. And there are some, I will try to give trigger warnings because there are some slides that show some unpleasant things that if folks are sensitive to seeing unpleasant things, I mean, we are here talking about problems and what's going wrong, and some of those problems are kind of ugly. So we'll go ahead and get started. Oops. Okay, we're going to start with wild horses and burros. And this is a map of the wild horse and burro herd management areas in purple here. And in the pink, you can see all of those former wild horse and burro HMAs that have been zeroed out and dialed down to herd areas. And so they're managed now for 0 wild horses. And interestingly, the Wild Horse and Burro Act states that it's the policy of Congress that wild and free roaming horses and burros shall be considered in the area where presently found, that's 1972, as an integral part of the natural system of the public lands. But you can see in about a third of those lands that they did exist, they don't exist anymore. And that is a legal conundrum, I think. That is a problematic one. Also, one thing to note is that some of the areas that are currently shown as being occupied herd management areas have been slated in the red desert to be zeroed out. So the agencies are actively trying to shrink the acreage of public lands where wild horses and burros are permitted to be. And as many of you will know, if you've been out to view wild horses, wild horse populations and behavior are based on a highly social band structure. And so you have bands that are each guarded by a band stallion, which may also have some lieutenant stallions. And so here you see one of these lieutenant stallions from the Salt Wells herd battling to keep another stallion in line. And then the harem or the females and mares and the young that go along with that. And when you have a highly social animal or mammal with a complex social structure, and you come in with the blunt instrument of a helicopter roundup that basically breaks up the bands and takes away their social structure, and kind of takes a big chunk of them out and leaves a bunch of them behind and disrupts those band social structures, you get a lot of chaos, and you get a lot of extra breeding from that. And so when the Bureau of Land Management is pursuing these helicopter roundups, they're actually accelerating wild horse breeding. Now, one thing to note is that even though the Bureau of Land Management likes to say that wild horses are really big reproducers, the fact of the matter is, I've never seen twins. And most large herbivores will twin. Elk will twin, deer will twin, pronghorns will twin when they're on a high plane of nutrition. So wild horses will not twin, but will only have a single foal each breeding season. So they actually do reproduce more slowly than most herbivores. However, their survival rate is very, very high. So in terms of the population sizes, and many of you will be familiar with Gus Cothran's study from Texas A&M University. That now Gus Cothran's study is based on the presumption that an effective number of 50 breeding animals will get you genetic viability. That's 1990s level science. There's a new study in 2014 by Frankham and others that finds that for genetic viability, you need at least 100 breeding individuals in order to have genetic viability. And so if you don't have that level of genetic viability, you start losing your genetic diversity from your herd. You start ending up with things like clubfoot and other types of genetic mutations. You end up with inbreeding depression, which is the failure to have as many offspring or thriving offspring. So it's a big problem. I took a look at wild horses in particular, and there was a Singer et al. 2000 study that was done in the Pryor Mountains, and it found a correction coefficient to identify how many wild horses it takes to get to an effective number of 100 breeding individuals. Because if you have a skewed population, if you have one stallion breeding many mares, then that reduces the way the calculation is made. And when you dial all these calculations in and you crunch the numbers, you need 278 actual animals in your herd in order to have genetic minimum viable population. Now, if you have two wild horse herd management areas that are right next to each other and they're exchanging animals, they're also exchanging genetic material. And so you should consider the meta population of all the connected herds together with this genetic minimum viable population. However, my organization, Western Watersheds Project, is presently suing on two isolated herds in Oregon, the Kiger and Riddle herds, which are not connected to other wild horses and which in fact have an appropriate management level set for them that is somewhere between 35 and 50 animals, which is far below genetic minimum viable population size. The agency should not be doing this. This is a biological problem that needs to be corrected. Some of the problems with the Bureau of Land Management's wild horse and burro policies are that they don't seem to be following the law. And under the Wild Horse and Burro Act, Congress stated that wild free-roaming horses and burros shall be protected from capture, branding, harassment, or death. Well, here are some wild horses being harassed by the federal government on their way to being captured by the federal government. So obviously, in some strange way, the federal government has managed not to follow its own laws when it comes to wild horses and burros. And this is, an enduring mystery to me, principally because I'm part of an organization that's commonly suing the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, and other federal agencies for not following their own laws. So in my mind, these laws were put in place by Congress for agencies to follow, not just common members of the population. And here is a shot of wild horses that have not been branded by the BLM, apparently, because that would be illegal. I'm not sure why this happens or why it's allowed to happen. I'm not sure what the legal history is with that, but maybe there's somebody in the Q&A period who can answer that question for me. So when the cattle industry and its allies go out and lobby and say that wild horses are overpopulated, first of all, they're lying because originally, back in the time of Lewis and Clark, there were 2 to 7 million wild horses on the North American continent, and we actually saw better land health, better vegetation condition than anybody alive today has ever seen in the West. So having 2 to 7 million of these wild horses, together with 60 million bison, together with 10 million elk, together with tens of millions of pronghorn and mule deer, did not have a negative impact on the range at that time before white colonization and settlement of the West and the introduction of domestic livestock. Now, presently, the Bureau of Land Management estimates there are 58,952 wild horses on the Western public lands. And, you know, the folks with the Bureau of Land Management like to say, well, that's far more than the 28,000 that we have set for their appropriate management level. But the difficulty is that the appropriate management level is an arbitrarily set political target that's basically there to appease the livestock industry. The livestock industry on those same public lands have 1.6 million livestock that are using those same public lands. And the livestock industry is very, very fond of saying, hey, wait a minute, the wild horses are out there 12 months a year, but the livestock are only out there for a few months. And for about 70% of the grazing allotments, that's true. For the other 30%, the livestock are out there year round. But when you look at the animal unit months, or how many cow-calf pairs per month or 5 sheep per month are out there, and you aggregate it, you find out that there are about 20 million animal unit months of cattle and sheep that are authorized. So that's a statement of how many animals per month. And if you convert the wild horses to animal unit months, that's 707,000 animal unit months. So right there, you've got about 15 times the number of animal unit months of livestock on the public lands versus wild horses. But also, the wild horses are only on the federal lands. The cattle and sheep are on private and federal lands, both. And in fact, the vast majority of the cattle and sheep are in fact on private lands. Wildlife, and I'm interested in wildlife. I'm interested in elk. I'm interested in coyotes. I'm interested in beavers, all kinds of species. Wildlife don't know who owns the land, so they don't respect private land boundaries. So cattle on all land ownerships of the West, the ones that are affecting the wildlife populations, are 18.5 million in Western states. That makes the total ratio of cattle to horses in the American West 313 to 1. And even today, at what the Bureau of Land Management claims to be overpopulated levels of wild horses, the wild horses are only 5.9% of the animal unit months that are authorized for cattle and sheep. And to dial this down to a herd management area level, this is an analysis that we did for the Anarchy herd management level in 2021 when they were being slated to be rounded up. And the Bureau of Land Management at that time said, hey, there are 474 wild horses. Those wild horses are overpopulated. They're going to die of starvation. Those 474 wild horses, even at that quote unquote overpopulated level, amounted to 5,688 animal unit months. The cattle and sheep that were authorized on those same lands totaled 19,592 animal unit months. So there were 4 times the amount of cattle and sheep animal unit months of grazing on the Anarchy Mountain herd management area. It's a wild horse herd management area that's supposed to be managed for the benefit of wild horses. And yet, at the same time, the agency is authorizing almost 4 times the number of cattle and sheep grazing on this area, and then saying that the 1/4 level of wild horses are overpopulated and need to be rounded up. That's what you guys are up against. Here's another interesting talking point that I came across in December on a blog called, I think it was called Big Hunt Guys. It was a podcast that was from December 5th, and I think you can find it online. And on this podcast, the gal on the right, whose name is Jenny Luciette, who is a former BLM Wild Horse and Burro Public Affairs Officer, states, on an average, a horse will eat 20 pounds of forage per day. We're talking a minimum of 5 gallons of water per day to a maximum, in the heat of summer, 15, 20 gallons of water per horse per day. Out on the range, about 10 gallons is really the average. And so what she's trying to say is that wild horses really eat a lot of forage and drink a lot of water, and that's a big problem. But what she's not telling you is that cattle eat 24 to 32 pounds of forage per day. And cattle will drink between 20 and 24 gallons of water per day for themselves, and another 5 to 10 gallons per day for their calf on a hot day. So, apples to apples, cattle eat more and drink more than wild horses. So, when you're pointing the finger at wild horses and saying there's a problem out there on the range, you might be trying to pull the wool over somebody's eyes. The other issue that I think folks fail to really fully appreciate here is that on federal grazing leases, the cattle and sheep lessee is authorized to graze away 50 to 65% of all of the forage that grows between January 1st and December 31st of every year. In other words, 50 to 65% of the forage is going into livestock. 35 to 50% is left for wild horses, if it's a herd management area, but also for elk and for deer and for grasshoppers and for jackrabbits and for mice and every other species of herbivore that's out there. And then at the end of the day, you still have to have enough forage or enough vitality in the native perennial bunch grasses that live for up to 30 years for those grasses to survive in the next year. And guess what? It's not happening. And cheatgrass infestations are one of the biggest scourges in Western public lands today. And what happens is when the cattle are grazing at this 50 to 65% utilization level, they are destroying the native perennial bunch grasses. They are disturbing the soil. They are bringing in cheatgrass and other weed seeds trapped in their hide and dropping them off. And they're like the Johnny Appleseed of invasive weeds. And you get these big cheatgrass infestations like you can see in the understory of this sagebrush step on the right. And then on the left, you see what happens is that flammable cheatgrass, which is an annual plant that only is green for 6 weeks of the year, then it dies and dries out. When it's dry, it's just the perfect fuel for fire, and it burns. And that fire burns away all of the sagebrush. And the sagebrush is really the staff of life for most wildlife species. And the sagebrush will not resprout from its stumps like many shrub species will. So this is a major conversion, and it becomes what's called a cheatgrass monoculture. Now, the solution is to take the cattle off. And on the left, you see an exclosure. This is the salmon allotment in northeastern Nevada. This is an area that, by the way, doesn't have any wild horses. But this exclosure on the left is fenced off from livestock. It was set up about 4.5 years or 5.5 years before the photo on the right was taken. And so just in the 5 years' time, these big, healthy bunch grasses have basically sprouted out of seemingly nothing. On the right is a shot that I took just outside the fence. And you can see there is nothing but cheatgrass in the understory here. There's not a sign of a single perennial bunch grass anywhere in the shot. And so it looks like the perennial bunch grass is completely gone. But if you remove the cattle grazing, which is what keeps the land in cheatgrass, then the native bunch grasses have a chance to rebound. And guess what? Perennial bunch grasses are nature's best defense against cheatgrass. The adult bunch grasses prevent the cheatgrass seedlings from getting established because they're superior competitors for soil nutrients and water. But once the bunch grasses are wiped out, then on a seedling to seedling basis, the cheatgrass dominates and it kind of takes over and then perpetuates itself ever after. So you got to prevent that kind of overgrazing that leads to cheatgrass infestations. One of the other interesting myths that's out there is the myth that fire is really causing cheatgrass. It's not livestock grazing at all. And here's an ungrazed area of the Idaho National Energy Laboratory, or INL now, that burned in 2004. But this is part of an INL that doesn't have any cattle on it because about half of this nuclear testing facility doesn't allow livestock. And in this part that didn't have any cows, when it burned, what came back? Native perennial bunch grasses, not cheatgrass, because the bunch grasses will stump sprout after a fire. You don't get the sagebrush anymore, but you do get the bunch grasses. This is what demonstrates conclusively that when people are telling you that cheatgrass is caused by fire, they're trying to cover up for the livestock that are causing the real damage. The livestock industry and its apologists, some of them published scientists, like to say, oh yes, cheatgrass is an artifact of overgrazing that happened during the Dust Bowl or during the turn of the 20th century. And really, today's grazing doesn't actually contribute to that. Well, here are a couple of maps showing the distribution of cheatgrass and how it changed between 1990 and 2018. And what you can see is that the cheatgrass infestations have spread and have become much more intense over that, close to 30-year span. So it's not just an artifact of ancient grazing wrongs that happened during the time before the automobile. This is ongoing damage and degradation of the landscape that's happening today that is causing the continuing spread of cheatgrass. And these infestations are getting worse and worse all the time. Now, take a screenshot here if you're interested in learning more about cheatgrass, because I joined a couple of published botanists to review all of the literature that's ever been published on cheatgrass. And what that literature review shows is that domestic livestock are the single most important cause. They are the ecological switch that leads from a state of native perennial bunch grasses to a state of degraded, invaded cheatgrass domination. It's the livestock. Interestingly, just this past year, I had our GIS specialist do a little meta-analysis of wild horse herd management areas and cheatgrass, because I was curious to see, how does cheatgrass line up to wild horse herd management areas? And what I found was really interesting. Now, this wasn't subjected to any statistics, but what you do see is that in categories where the cheatgrass cover is less than 2%, inside the herd management areas, 40% of the lands are less than 2% cheatgrass. Outside the herd management areas, only 21% are less than 2%. And when you're talking more than 2% cheatgrass, in every single category, there are more lands in these higher cheatgrass classifications outside the wild horse herd management areas than inside. Now, wild horse herd management areas have livestock and wild horse grazing both. I'm not sure that there's any mechanistic explanation for why these wild horse herd management areas have lower levels of cheatgrass infestation. But what you can't say is that wild horses cause degraded rangelands, because cheatgrass is the biggest sign and signifier that you have degraded rangeland. So if there's less cheatgrass in the wild horse herd management areas, you're forced to concede that, well, no, having these wild horse herds doesn't actually cause you land health problems compared to areas that have livestock but no wild horses. Now, it's not just land health issues that have impacts from the livestock industry. One of the most important things that happen in the Western rangelands when you lease lands for livestock grazing is you're putting up barbed wire fences everywhere. And there are an estimated 620,000 miles of barbed wire fencing in the American West. And I'm a sage grouse person, so I've focused a lot on sage grouse issues. Sage grouse are a low-flying bird. They cannot see the barbed wire strands. They commonly collide with these barbed wire fences and guillotine themselves. In one less than 5-mile stretch of fence in western Wyoming, researchers found 146 dead sage grouse that got killed by fence strikes in a 2.5-year period. Now, I'm not saying that every single mile of this 620,000 miles of fence is going to have that same big impact on sage grouse. It could be that this was just a 5-mile stretch of fence that was in particularly high density sage grouse habitat. But if you have sage grouse and you have fences, then you have collision mortality. And the agency likes to say, well, we can put these little fence markers, these little plastic clips on the fence so the sage grouse can see them. That drops your sage grouse collision mortality anywhere between 57% and 82%. That still leaves a lot of collision deaths, even if you put those fence clips on. And now for sensitive folks, close your eyes, please, because this slide is going to be upsetting. Fences also have impacts on wild horses. And this is a wild horse that died trapped in a cattle guard in the Powder Rim, a shot that I took a number of years ago. So the fences do block the migration of species, including wild horses. They entangle species, including deer and elk. I personally have had to cut pronghorn out of fences. I'm going to move on so folks can open their eyes. And so fences are a big problem, and getting rid of the fences should be a priority for everybody that cares about healthy lands. Another issue of the livestock industry that it brings to the high country is that domestic sheep are carriers of a couple of different deadly diseases. It is Mycoplasma haemolycta, and there's another one too that was formerly, I think it's Mannheimia ovanpneumoniae, and these two are almost like AIDS for sheep, for bighorn sheep. And when bighorn sheep catch these diseases, which they did not evolve with, they get this horrible pneumonia that they transmit to their lambs, and they have lamb crop failures. And then the bighorn sheep herds die off. In the main photograph here, you can see this is a domestic sheep ewe approaching a herd and sniffing a herd of domestic sheep. There's a bighorn sheep ewe getting in contact in a way that's likely to transmit these types of pathogens. This is likely one of the biggest reasons that bighorn sheep herds all across the American West fail to thrive, is because of these diseases. The solution is you have to keep the domestic sheep at least 15 miles away from known occupied bighorn sheep habitat. That's the fix. It's very difficult to get the agencies, however, to do this. Here come a series of pretty upsetting slides, so sensitive people, close your eyes. The livestock industry comes with its own death squad called USDA Wildlife Services. And the livestock industry itself engages in an awful lot of wildlife killing. And so targeting coyotes, targeting wolves, targeting grizzly bears, targeting prairie dogs, targeting anything that gets in their way. They've got their own federal agency that will go around on a complaint basis and kill native wildlife so that the livestock industry can have more profitable operations. Keep your eyes closed. The Wildlife Services uses devices called M44 cyanide bombs. They're basically a landmine that when triggered, there's a bait that is put on them that canids will sniff, and when triggered, they spray cyanide poison in the face of the wildlife. And they are designed to kill primarily coyotes, but they also kill just about every other species of wildlife because they're left unattended. The one on the left, the cyanide bomb, this is a photograph of the cyanide bomb that poisoned Canyon Mansfield, the 14-year-old boy in Pocatello, Idaho in 2017. Today, these cyanide bombs are not being used, at least they weren't under the Biden administration, in the Bureau of Land Management lands, but still could be used on Forest Service lands. We're trying to get these phased out. They're archaic. There's no excuse for having these. So now all the sensitive folks can open your eyes for a moment. The eradication of large carnivores is definitely part of the livestock industry's agenda. And the solution is to keep these carnivores on the endangered species list. In those areas where wolves have been removed from Endangered Species Act protection in Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana, parts of eastern Washington and eastern Oregon, we see major problems with state agencies ramping up killing, ramping up the number of trophy hunting tags, ramping up the seasons that you're allowed to kill them. For instance, in Wyoming, in 85% of the state, you can kill any wolf at any time, kill as many as you want without any bag limit, without even having a hunting license. All of that's perfectly legal. That's what happens when you give these conservative Western states control of large carnivore wildlife management. They turning it into a killing field. That's what happens. So in terms of science-based wolf management, what should we have? What's the fix? Well, first of all, there's no scientific basis at all managing wolf populations through lethal methods, whether that's hunting or whether that's predator control. Wolves are an apex predator. Their populations self-regulate through territoriality. They don't have any use for human management. Second, management of wolf livestock conflicts needs to be happening on a coexistence basis with no lethal option. There are methods that the livestock industry can coexist with wolves and have minimal losses of their livestock. They just have to do the due diligence. And we need, as a society, to make sure they're doing that. And then for coexistence to work effectively, it can't be voluntary. If rancher A is doing coexistence and rancher B is still killing wolves, all of the wolves are going to be eradicated by rancher B. So everybody has to have this non-lethal approach. Otherwise, coexistence doesn't work. Trigger alert, close your eyes. Trapping. It's allowed on most public lands. It's managed by the states. The federal agencies just step back and don't regulate it. This is something that kills an awful lot of people's pets. It kills a lot of non-target animals. Typically, the traps can be left to linger for 72 hours or more before they have to be checked, which means that the animals that get trapped are killed in the traps or die of exposure or thirst in the traps. This is something that probably needs to be ended on federal public lands at the very least. Keep your eyes closed, please. Believe it or not, there are psychotic people in the Western United States who engage in wildlife killing contests. They have contests to see which one can kill the most coyotes or the biggest coyote or the smallest coyote. They have gambling that's associated with this. And this is permitted on Western public lands, depending on if that special use permit is granted. So that's something that needs to end. And then to bring it back to wild horses for a moment, it's important to note, and we're back, it's okay to look now again. It's important to note that both wolves and mountain lions are potentially important natural predators for wild horses. And there's some new and emerging science that's coming out of Nevada that's showing that certain wild horse herds are losing quite a large number of their foals every year. And that mountain lions in particular are able to exert so much specialization on wild horses that individual mountain lions are eating mostly wild horses, even when they have mule deer to prey upon. And so, if you want to have a more natural circle of life in the Western United States, the mountain lion is an effective ambush predator for juniper woodlands and steep and rocky habitats. They're not going to be a very effective wild horse predator out in the open basins. The wolves are coursing predators. They're good at the open basins. So allowing wolves to repopulate in areas like Nevada, which are historic and natural wolf habitat, but which the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has arbitrarily claimed is unsuitable for wolves, those wolf populations need to recover in those areas. So the livestock industry also has it in for prairie dogs, and prairie dogs are really important keystone members of the ecosystem. They're the basis for habitat for species like the black-footed ferret, which is shown here, which is on the endangered species list, the burrowing owl, the mountain plover, many other rare species depend on the prairie dog. Out on the high plains, it's the black-tailed prairie dog. West of the Continental Divide, in Wyoming and west into Idaho, it's the white-tailed prairie dog. Down into Colorado and Utah, it's the Gunnison prairie dog and the Utah prairie dog. And so these prairie dogs have been targeted by the livestock industry for eradication with poisons. And that sort of thing needs to change and end. In other words, one of the main problems that we're facing is that we have industries like the livestock industry that think that the whole world ought to revolve around their livestock, and they ought to be able to wipe out any other species that gets in their way. That's the kind of sick thinking that needs to end. And we need to have federal regulations that make it so on public lands. And we need to have state regulations that make it so on private lands as well, for that matter. Another really important species that's targeted by the livestock industry for eradication is the beaver. And of course, the beaver first took its big hits back in the 16 and 1700s when the French fur trappers and later the Hudson's Bay Company and then the American Fur Company and other big trapping corporations trapped out beavers so that they could make top hats out of their underfur. But then the livestock industry has found beavers to be very inconvenient as well. And they have gone after beavers because they build dams that block the culverts in their roads and the roads wash out and then they have to repair the road. Well, instead of taking a non-lethal approach of trying to discourage the beavers from those particular locations, the livestock industry has wiped out the beavers. But here's the problem. In the arid West, the beavers were responsible, even out in arid places like Nevada, for maintaining the subsurface irrigation of the entire bottomland. And so they were a major source of productivity for bottomlands because by building these dams, they're not just backing the water up behind the dam in the stream itself. That water is backing up into the soil of the surrounding floodplain, and it's holding that water on the land for longer. So two things are happening. You have radically increased biodiversity and productivity in your bottomlands in these arid areas. And instead of the stream drying up during the dry season, you have surface water year round for all the species to drink and for the rare trout species to live in. And what has happened by wiping out the beaver, not just in the interior West, but also on the Great Plains, is that many of the formerly permanently flowing streams that used to water these landscapes and keep them wetter, more productive, more biodiverse, have dried up because of the lack of the beaver. So reinstituting beavers all across the landscape is really important. Now, I promised we were going to be ambitious, so we're going to look at other issues besides just livestock and wild horse issues, because there are a lot of issues on Western public lands that we're going to be facing. One of those issues is the idea of fuel breaks. And many land managers are pushing the idea of fuel breaks as a way to slow down or stop wildfires. And of course, due to climate change, we have longer droughts, we have more arid temperatures, we have more extreme heat, all of the conditions that mean bigger fires. Now, the answer is not to create fuel breaks across the landscape because number one, they don't work. So you might have heard during the Los Angeles fires and the Palisade fire just this last month that people were talking about, oh, gee, there wasn't enough water, but that fire was spotting 2 miles ahead of the flame front. It was spotting across fuel breaks. Every street was a fuel break. It just doesn't matter. Fuel breaks don't do anything. So basically these fuel breaks, what they are, is they're a way for federal agencies to say, gee, public, we spent $5 million and 10,000 person hours out there building all of these miles of fuel breaks. And when the fire came through and wiped out your town anyway, we did our very best. So we're sorry that it didn't work. And then hoping the locals will say, we forgive you. But here's a fuel break in my local neck of the woods that was jumped by the Whittier fire. Another fire about 3 years ago jumped the Columbia River. Can you imagine a more perfect fuel break than a quarter to a half a mile wide of water? You can't create that on the land, and yet the fire jumped right over it. Fires have jumped across 6 and 8 lane highways. There's just no way during extreme fire conditions, and these are the conditions when you get these really big fires, when the winds are high, when the moisture, fuel moisture is low, when the air has very little humidity and the wind is blowing, fuel breaks don't matter. And this is what they're actually there to protect you from. And so it's a pointless waste of taxpayer dollars and it's destructive ecologically. And sometimes these fuel breaks even make things worse. Here's a photograph of a fuel break from Oregon that's become overgrown with flammable weeds, in this case, cheatgrass. So if you don't actually maintain your fuel break and keep all the vegetation out of it, it can be a source of fire rather than a fire break. Another part of the universe where the logging industry wants you to believe they can help is in clear cutting. And the logging industry for many, many years has promoted this idea of, well, let's clear cut the forest because, a healthy forest needs to be cut. Clearly, they didn't talk to the trees. They didn't talk to the interior forest wildlife obligates. They didn't talk to the ecologists because clear cutting simply fragments the forest and opens it up. And then in a fire condition, the logging industry would like you to believe that clear cuts are going to become fire breaks. Well, here's a clear cut that I took a picture of from the Graham Fire on the Medicine Bow National Forest in 2003. And as you can see, the fire raced right across this clear cut, didn't stop it, didn't slow it, burned to the ground, down to bare soil. Why is that? It's pretty simple. In a natural fire, what happens is the branches and the twigs and the needles and the forest duff all burn away. But as you see in this photograph, the actual big boles of the trees are left behind because they don't burn. Well, if you're logging for a commercial logging operation, you're actually cutting down the tree, taking away the tree trunk that wasn't going to burn anyway, and you're leaving behind all of the fine fuels that actually burn. So you're not making the forest any less flammable. So we're going to probably see during the next 4 years a big ramp up in logging on national forest lands. It will make our forests more unhealthy than they were before and more fire prone than they were before. A related item out in the Great Basin area is deforestation of pinyon juniper woodlands. And you have these what are called habitat treatment projects, where they will basically take a bulldozer dragging a giant anchor chain from a ship to wipe out all of the pinyon and juniper trees. And the idea is that the pinyon and juniper trees are invading other habitats, but that's not true. Pinyon and juniper are native species in the interior West. They are right here where they belong. They are not more abundant than they were historically. Under natural conditions, the pinyon juniper forests expand and contract depending on whether it's wetter, they expand. When it's drier, they contract. And that's all part of the natural cycle. What's really going on here is the livestock industry wants to get rid of all of these trees, hoping what they'll get is grasses, because these pinyon juniper trees drop all kinds of needles, and then grasses don't grow in the understory. So for cattle and sheep, a pinyon juniper woodland, once it becomes mature, has no forage to eat. And so they want to reset the pinyon juniper woodlands to a grass state. But by doing this heavy industrial scale deforestation, you actually increase the likelihood that you're going to get invasive weeds and flammable cheatgrass in particular. Now, if you're a livestock permittee, you'd rather have cheatgrass than junipers because your cow can eat cheatgrass during 6 weeks out of the year, but can't ever eat juniper or pinyon. So they're preferring to have the weeds than to have the junipers and the pinyons, but it's worse for all of the juniper obligate songbirds. It's worse for the mule deer that have cover in these areas. So this is a big wipeout. And it's also really bad for climate because these pinyon juniper woodlands are sequestering an awful lot of carbon that's getting wiped out in one fell swoop when we cut them all down. Another big issue out there in the West are greater sage grouse. And at one time, there were 16 million greater sage grouse in the West. There are accounts from naturalists in the 1800s of sage grouse flocks that turned entire valleys gray with the birds as they got up and flew in their thousands. I've never seen anything like that myself, and I don't think anyone alive ever has. Sage grouse are quite rare today. Now, there are about 250,000 throughout the West, and they are still declining today. They're declining because of heavy livestock grazing. They're declining in part because of roads and habitat fragmentation, oil and gas development, and other things, but livestock is the most widespread impact. And certainly climate change is layering an additional stressor onto these sage grouse, because when we have these more combustible conditions and we have these cheatgrass invasions that are caused by livestock, you have the recipe for subtracting all that sagebrush from the landscape. Sage grouse can't live without sagebrush. It's 90% of their diet every year is buds and leaves of sagebrush. They nest under the sagebrush. They just can't live without it. So when we lose the sagebrush, we do lose the sage grouse. Now, there are some dishonest scientists, and I'm going to call them dishonest scientists because that's the way I think about it, that have said that wild horses are a major problem for sage grouse. And there's a fellow by the name of Peter Coates in particular who put out a study in 2021 saying that in California and Nevada, that wild horse herd areas where the wild horses were overpopulated, that was causing declines of sage grouse. And so what we really needed to do if we want sage grouse to thrive is decrease the number of wild horses out in the landscape. But you know what Peter Coates didn't offer to his model to test the impacts of? He didn't offer livestock to the model, even though the very same herd management areas that are grazed by wild horses are also grazed by cattle and sheep. This is scientific fraud. And one of our professionals from Western Watersheds Project, when he rolled out this study in 2021, was on the webinar and asked him, well, why didn't you look at livestock impacts when you were testing the impacts of grazing on sage grouse? And the answer was, well, sage grouse or livestock are basically part of the baseline out there. There's a constant managed amount of livestock grazing, so it can't be affecting the sage grouse, is what the researchers implied. And Peter Coates at that time did say that they were working on a similar study in Wyoming, and they were considering looking at the livestock impacts. Well, guess what? In late 2024, Peter Coates and his co-authors rolled out their Wyoming study, blaming wild horses once again for sage grouse declines. And once again, they didn't even look at the impacts of cattle. That's how crooked some of these research agencies are. Western Watersheds Project has a Freedom of Information Act request right now to try and get into Peter Coates' files to see who all he was colluding with to try and get these biased scientific results, because this is clearly the opposite of valid deductive research. This is inductive reasoning where you're actually setting up the wild horses to be the scapegoat. It's a giant pile of horse manure. Other issues that we're facing out there, we're going to see a lot more mineral extraction. Under the Trump administration's energy dominance policy, expect to see millions of acres of public lands leased to the oil and gas industry. Whether we're going to see giant, massive projects like the Jonah Field shown here in this photograph or not is entirely dependent on market forces. If the price of natural gas goes up from its current level of about $2.25 a thousand cubic feet, which won't support oil and gas drilling, to $5 or $6 or $8 a thousand cubic feet, we may see an awful lot of oil and gas drilling renewed on Western public lands. And that's bad news for any species that is impacted by industrial activity. And, you know, anecdotally, I've noticed that wild horses in the red desert do tend to avoid oil and gas fields. We also have mining that is ramping up all across the West. And I would suspect that we have additional mining that we're going to have to be facing over the coming years. And that's going to be an issue. Under the mining laws that we have today, it's called the 1872 mining law, it almost exempts miners from having to comply with the environmental impact types of regulations and laws that the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service apply to every other industry. And the agencies will even say things like, well, gee, we can't even control what the mining companies do because of the 1872 mining law. I personally disagree with that assertion, but there's some case law that goes in that direction, and the agencies are convinced of it. So mines are very hard to fight. We have a lot of lithium mining right now. We're seeing uranium mining ramping up in the Red Desert again. We could see another renewal of the idea of oil shale mining. That rises up about every 15 years, and the oil industry thinks that it can, you know, muster up the technology to make it profitable. They never have yet, but they keep thinking they will. So watch out for that as well. One of the solutions that is a complete illusion is the idea of regenerative grazing. And just as a joke, as a thought exercise on April Fool's Day, I created this slide as, what would it look like if you had regenerative livestock grazing? Well, you would have cattle that were crossed with hummingbirds that could hover above the land, not step a foot on the land, and they would have chloroplasts that were bred into them so that they could photosynthesize. They wouldn't have to eat any grass, and that would be regenerative grazing. But the current idea that people are trying to sell of regenerative grazing is the idea that you can rotate more cattle through an area by bunching them up into dense herds, grazing at high intensity but short duration levels and moving them around very rapidly. But what the science shows is that when you have the same number of animal unit months dedicated to this high intensity, low frequency grazing rotation, or you compare that to the same animal unit months that are just dispersed grazing, the way that the livestock industry has always done it, just throw the cattle out in the spring and gather them up in the fall, the impacts are the same. The only way that you can get the regenerative model to have a lower environmental impact is to reduce the amount of cattle AUMs versus the more conventional method. And you can reduce the amount of cattle AUMs for the conventional method too and get the same results. So it's all just smoke and mirrors. But one of the interesting things that's emerging as a possible path forward is the idea of rewilding. And this is a map from a scientific article called Rewilding the American West by Ripple and others in 2022. And this shows the areas that they identified as having large blocks of protected lands that would be suitable for wolf restoration, that would be ideal for rewilding. And they prescribed in these areas a three-pronged approach to rewilding large tracts of public land. The first thing these researchers recommended would be to use voluntary grazing permit retirements to eliminate livestock, get those out of the way. Then bring back wolves to the landscape. That's happening on its own in many places. In Colorado, it's happening through reintroductions right now. And then bring back the beavers. Interestingly, this paper, if you look it up, took a look at all of the species listed under the Endangered Species Act as threatened or endangered and the factors that were leading to their endangerment. And the number one cause wasn't logging, it wasn't oil and gas extraction, it was livestock grazing as the leading threat that was causing the endangerment of these species. Well, to wrap things up, let's bring it back to wild horses. It's important to note that we have a fiscal oddity going on in our wild horse and burro program, which is this. The Bureau of Land Management is authorizing the renting of public lands at a rate of $1.35 per cow-calf pair per month to be on Western public lands, the same lands where wild horses live. When you remove wild horses from these lands that are worth $1.35 an animal unit month, and put them in long-term holding in eastern Kansas and eastern Oklahoma, then the federal government has to pay the landowners $60 an animal unit month to house those wild horses for the rest of their lives. So it makes more fiscal sense to leave wild horses on Western public lands and instead reduce the number of cattle until you achieve the land health objective of a thriving natural ecological balance. That's the path forward if you want healthy lands. And it gives you the side benefit of wild horses for those that like to see those. And as a side benefit, you don't have to pay helicopter companies millions of dollars to round up the wild horses and then all the transportation costs either. So if you're a fiscal conservative, in this age of the Department of Government Efficiency, leaving wild horses free on the range makes a lot more fiscal sense than rounding them up and putting them up on much more expensive private land out in eastern Oklahoma and eastern Kansas. And from an ecological perspective, how much sense does it make to take an animal, the wild horse, which co-evolved in arid Western lands like the ones in North America and is ecologically suited to these lands, and reduce those species so that you can bring in cattle, which are evolved to wet, lush northern forests of Northern Europe. Why does that make sense? And then take the wild horses off of the arid lands where they're, doing relatively less damage, putting them on private lands on the eastern part of the plains that are ecologically suited for cattle. And those horses are then displacing cattle from lands that are ecologically far more suited to cattle and far more productive to cattle as well than the arid West. So that's something that I think is an argument that might be made at this, in this moment of government efficiency. Why are we growing wild horses on the eastern plains while we're growing cattle in the arid West where they don't belong? That makes no sense. And then finally, another solution that's available to the Bureau of Land Management is that in their own regulations, they have a provision that says, if necessary to provide habitat for wild horses or burros, the authorized officer may close appropriate areas of the public lands to grazing use by all or a particular kind of livestock. Closure may be temporary or permanent. So these wild horse herd management areas, why rent them to livestock at all? You have this provision in the Code of Federal Regulations, that's 43 CFR 4710.5, that the agency is authorized to use in order to close these lands to livestock and improve the lot of the habitat and improve conditions for wild horses. Why don't we do that? It makes a great deal of sense. You'd have better land health if you did. And then finally, if all else fails, you have the legal system. And if you want a federal agency to stop doing what is harmful to the environment, you can go and build relationships with them if you like, and you can negotiate with them until the cows come home. But the cows never come home, and you never get anywhere. At Western Watersheds Project, we've tried it both ways. And frankly, the lawsuit gets you a lot more decisive results. So I think for my money, the wild horse universe would be well benefited by muscling up. And I would like to see a horse justice organization that hires professional attorneys and makes their legal services available to all the little 1 and 2 person wild horse advocacy groups free of charge, so that they can have the legal ability that conservation groups all across the West have today with organizations like Earth Justice, Western Environmental Law Center, and Advocates for the West. It's a really good, elegant solution to help driving accountability for federal agencies. And I think that that's an idea whose time has come. And what's needed is to have the wild horse donors that really want to see this happen step forward and create the organization. I think with $500,000 a year, you could make it happen. And over time, it might even become self-sustainable. So that's my slideshow that I have for the evening. And I want to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Erik. Even I learn new stuff every single time you do a presentation. They're just phenomenal, and I think it's stuff that people definitely need to see. In tune with the title of our summit, Linda Flora is asking, what can we do now? So I guess, that's a loaded question, obviously, but what would you say is the number 1 and number 2 things that advocates can do right now?
Well, right now, I think that wild horse advocates might think about the threat or the possibility that either Congress will try to reauthorize horse slaughter in the United States to make it easier to dispose of wild horses lethally in the United States, or they will use prohibitions that already exist in the Wild Horse and Burro Act that allow the federal agencies to kill wild horses after they're captured. So what the solution there is to, rouse up the millions of people who support wild horses and get them all ready to make a coordinated letter writing campaign or email campaign or, Hill visit campaign to talk to members of Congress and defend against what I expect to be a radically hostile environment for wild horses that could lead to increased lethal methods. Now, the Wild Horse and Burro Act gives wild horses a greater degree of protection than most other species enjoy. Um, it is important to make sure that Wild Horse and Burro Act doesn't get undermined. It's important to play offense by, in my view, supporting Representative Titus's bill to end helicopter roundups would be a great step forward for everything in the wild horse universe. So working Congress and building the masses of voters that are needed to work Congress effectively would be, I think, job one. And job two would be to get involved with, to plug in with whoever it is that's watchdogging public lands in your neck of the woods on wild horse issues and on every other issue that you care about. Because you, to the extent that you can have professionals or really dedicated volunteers who are out there watchdogging the public lands, seeing what's going wrong, watchdogging the Federal Register, that's a really important role for citizens to have, whether they're professional NGOs or volunteer groups.
I think I had a train of thought and I just lost it. But I think a lot of advocates, if you could just quickly remind our advocates how important it is to contact their legislators with an issue and not just not to offend anybody, but not to just continually share it out on wild horse pages. But if you truly want something to change, that you need to contact your legislators. Can you just remind everybody of how important that is?
Well, when I have gone and lobbied different offices of Congress, which I've been doing for a quarter century now, one of the refrains that I hear all the time is, hey, if we get a couple of dozen calls on a particular topic in a given week, that really gets our boss's attention. And we start talking about it. And that's how you move the needle. So individuals who will take the time to write a personal individual email. And by the way, make it a personal individual email, a personal individual phone call, a personal individual visit. It's great and all to sign a petition. It's great and all to send a form letter that somebody auto filled with AI or something. But when a congressional office gets 354 of those, they're like, 354, just another one of those, auto bot replies, and they don't pay any attention to them. Put some of yourself into that communication, because that's what's needed to get the halls of Congress to pay attention to your particular issue, whether your particular issue is oil and gas or wild horses or wolves or, or homelessness, whatever your issue is. If your congressional offices aren't hearing about it, they're probably not paying attention to it, and they're probably not going to vote in a way that reflects your interests. So these are folks in Congress and in the administration, for that matter, who are juggling 1,000 different priorities. And in order for your priority to become their priority, you need to bring the numbers.
Chris, you have a question for Erik?
Yes, Eric, hello. I was watching the Senate confirmation hearings for Governor Burgum, Secretary Burgum now, and I'm not sure if you watched it, but the people from the senators from Utah and Nevada were talking about the percentage of their public lands in their state. And I think that one, if not both of them, were saying like almost 80% of Utah is public land. So that makes to me a good fight for them. How does that state function when they need housing, they need different things, and most of that land is tied up in public lands? What's a good argument for that?
Well, certainly the amount of public land in your state doesn't actually constrict your growth. I mean, look at the Salt Lake area. The Bureau of Land Management has the authority to do small lot, conversions around the edges of municipalities, and it's been doing that for years. I think that the argument that we need to privatize the public lands to build condos on every acre is really a cynical ploy to get a hold of public lands for the states, with the knowledge that the federal government has laws like the National Environmental Policy Act and the Federal Planning and Management Act and the National Forest Management Act that actually requires a process to be gone through that involves the public. When the states get the lands, they typically manage these lands for their highest dollar output, sometimes by law, sometimes by their constitutions. Now, all of these Western lands, or these Western land states, when they became states, they either had to adopt a law or adopt into their constitution a provision disclaiming any claim to future ownership of federal public lands. So Utah did this, Nevada did this, Wyoming did this, all these states that are now doing these land seizure bills know that their own constitutions don't allow them to claim federal public lands. But what they're trying to hope for is that the federal government will, of its own accord, divest the public lands to them. So they know they can't force the federal government to give them their lands. They know that the federal government has every legal right to have those lands, really, even the ones that say the federal government doesn't have that right to those lands, secretly they acknowledge it. But what they're really trying to do is to get a friendly administration that will give them the lands. And land seizure would be bad for every possible environmental, public lands, public access, recreation issue in the West that you can think of. I've been in areas that have large amounts of public land. I've lived in areas that have basically no federal public land. And the fact that you have large acreages of land that are owned by all Americans that are managed for multiple uses, including wildlife, including watersheds, including public recreation, is a huge benefit to those states that have it. And the idea that you can't get enough housing, that has to do with the markets of supply and demand in the housing markets. There's plenty of land to build houses.
Connie is asking, has there ever been a problem with mouth-foot disease transmitted from domestic livestock to wildlife on the range?
I don't know if hoof and mouth has gone from domestic livestock. I do know that, obviously we talked about the diseases the domestic sheep carry, but there's also a bovine form of I think it's Pasteurella, or maybe it's Mycoplasma. There's a bovine Mycoplasma that's been transmitted to pronghorn and has gone around the pronghorn herd. So when they're really stressed, they become very susceptible, and they've had big die-offs. During the last big deep snow winter in Wyoming, there were die-offs of pronghorn that just wiped out the herds, and it was almost all Mycoplasma bovi.
Kim is asking, and you might have just answered this. I was scrolling for questions, but she says, do you think it's good to put public lands back in the hands and control of the state or states?
The only people who want public lands and control of the states are the industries that want to extract the last dollar out of them and don't care about their health. That's what's behind the land seizure agenda, is to have big industries that want, instead of having multiple uses and multiple values, they want it to be single use, and the single use to be their corporate profits.
And that's what Utah just tried to do, yeah?
Utah's tried to do it. They'll probably keep trying to do it. And the Wyoming legislature has got a copycat bill now. So it's spreading,
Yes, they do.
it's being cookie cuttered all across the West now. And I'm sure we'll see a big rise up in it. Now, of course, Western public lands are one of the most highly popular and highly valued assets this country has. And everybody loves their Western public lands. So it seems highly unlikely that they'll be able to muster the kinds of majorities they'd need in Congress to actually pass legislation to do this. But it's something to be taken seriously and something to be guarded against. If they take federal lands and turn them over to the states, what would happen to the wild horses? Wild horses are only legally called wild horses on federal lands. Are they still wild horses? Would they be eliminated? Probably.
That's a really good point you made there, Eric. Janelle with Oregon Wild Horse Organization is asking if you can again just talk briefly about the lawsuit that you guys have on the Kiger and Riddle Mountain herds and how the lawsuit needs funding.
Oh, sure. Well, Western Watersheds Project and OWHO and the Central Oregon Wild Horse Coalition, I think it is, have brought a lawsuit to challenge the gather of the Kiger and Riddle herds in Oregon that was originally scheduled for October. Once we filed our lawsuit, we reached out to the DOJ and asked them to voluntarily delay the roundup, and they did. So we got a little pocket victory. But that lawsuit is going to cost a total of about $75,000. We have $25,000 that has been gathered already and conveyed to the attorneys, but we're going to need to raise another 50,000 to keep those attorneys going. And donations can be made either to Western Watersheds Project or to OWHO or to Colorado or Oregon, Central Oregon Wild Horse Coalition. And those donations should be specifically earmarked to the Kiger Riddle lawsuit. And those can be then conveyed, but we do need to raise about another 50,000 to make sure that we have the legal firepower to bring that case all the way through to get a ruling.
Couple more quick questions for you. Have you ever seen cattle or sheep get caught up in the barbed wire? I know I haven't, but I don't know if you have.
I haven't seen that. I'm sure it must happen though. I know that, I hear a lot about domestic horses getting caught up in barbed wire.
I have seen cows stuck in those cattle guards as well. So they really do need to design those cattle guards differently, that's for sure. The photo that you had of the fence where you talked about the sage grouse flying into them, Kim is asking if they can use that photograph with your wording on it.
I think so. I think it's a Flickr Creative Commons photo, and I think it has the attribution on it. So that means that it would be open access to use, yes.
Okay,
And
perfect.
most
Yeah,
of
I
the
did notice.
photographs in my presentation are my own personal photographs. They're property of WWP and or Wild Earth Guardians, and those are free to use too.
Okay, perfect. All right, you guys, I did put Erik's information in through the chat box, his contact screen, so you can get a hold of him if need be. I also put up their Western Watershed Project's website address and also the website address that accesses that map directly that you guys did with all the grazing allotments in it, which I have to say personally is something that I refer to nearly every week. I think that map, that grazing map, is just one of the most valuable tools. That and the peer grazing map, two of the most valuable tools that you guys have made available to everybody. And if you all go in and take a closer look at that map, you'll see a bunch of lines drawn out in various shapes all over the map. Those are not only does it show the herd management areas and the herd areas, but every single grazing allotment in those states is on those maps. And if you guys click inside those boxes, it will tell you how many livestock AUMs are allotted to each and every single one of those grazing permits. It doesn't give you the owner of the permit. Each and every grazing allotment has been given a nickname. So I think without a FOIA, you wouldn't be able to actually find out who owns it. But all right, one quick last question that I remember I saw much earlier on in the chat. Do you have an estimate for how many sheep are grazed on our public lands?
I know it's hundreds of thousands, but I don't have an actual number of the sheep. It's a lot harder to keep track of that stuff because the BLM and the Forest Service like to talk about the numbers of cows, and they don't talk as much about the numbers of sheep. Interestingly, there are not nearly as many domestic sheep today as there once were in the arid West. And it used to be sheep and cattle were about equal in numbers. And then, along about World War II, the U.S. government used mutton as an ingredient in sea rations. So whenever the troops were overseas, they were eating sheep and mutton every day. And when they came back from the war, they said to their families, "I don't want to eat sheep ever again." And it caused the biggest crash in the sheep industry that the industry has ever seen.
I have no problem with that, and I don't think any of the rest of us do either. So, all right, thank you so much, Erik, again for agreeing to speak at our summit this year. We'll look forward to inviting you again next year. And as always, your information is just so informative and invaluable to our fight for our public lands, our wildlife, and our wild horses and burros. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having the summit, and I admire all of you for your fortitude. Keep it up.
Thank you so much, Erik. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you again soon.